Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar by the Super Members Council, your update on everything related to the budget. Well, Yuma, welcome to today's post-budget briefing from the Super Members Council. We're broadcasting to you today live from Ngunnawal Ngambri country here in the nation's capital, long before the founders of the Federation decided to make this place the capital of our great nation. This has been a long-time meeting place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The high country, the hill country, the mountains around Canberra have always been a special place of people coming together to meet and to talk about important matters of the day. And in that tradition, we honour the traditional owners and greet you all today. Thank you so much for setting aside some time to join us for this quick overview of the key measures in the federal budget and the context, indeed, in which it has been crafted. We're delighted that you can be with us today. We're going to keep this session very tight to 30 minutes. I do want to ask that if you have questions, we encourage you to ask them now. We can obviously follow up if there are more questions than our 30 minutes allows. Please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, inside the Zoom platform to ask those questions, and we'll try to work through as many of them as we can within the time allowed. I'm Misha Schubert. It's my very great privilege to be the inaugural CEO of the Super Members Council, which was established, of course, last year in October to speak for and to advocate for the interests of 11 million everyday Australians who have their retirement savings invested in Australia's profit to member superannuation funds. What a great privilege it is for all of us to be in service of our fellow Australians in the work that each of us does across this sector to safeguard and steward people's retirement incomes in that way. I'm joined by our fabulous colleague, Matt Linden, the Executive General Manager of Strategy from the Super Members Council, who will take you through the granular detail, but I'm going to just quickly set the scene before we leap into that content. Obviously, this budget is crafted in the context of global uncertainty around the world and challenges with growth in many of the advanced economies of the world, driven by geopolitics and the complex set of circumstances that other national governments are navigating. But in the Australian context, it's no surprise that the public discussion for the last year and a half certainly has been about the acute cost of living pressures being faced by Australian families and households. And that's the really clear context in which this year's budget has been crafted with an eye to relieving that cost of living pressure in ways that do not further add to expenditure in the economy that would then drive up inflation, that would then invite the Reserve Bank to be in a position where it felt that it had to further lift interest rates. And so this budget, as we step you through that detail, shows that balancing act that the members of the Expenditure Review Committee of the Federal Cabinet have had to try to think through logically around the types of money that they have provisioned into the budget, but crafted in ways that try not to trigger inflationary effects that would make that challenge more difficult for trying to return Australia's inflation rate to within that Reserve Bank band, the target range of 2 to 3%. Many of the things that were in this year's federal budget were actually revealed in advance. Last night we were looking for rabbits in hats, and most of the substantive content had been pre-announced, including, of course, those really important measures that many people in this sector over a very long period of time have advocated for, that historic decision to add superannuation payments to the Commonwealth Paid Parental Leave Scheme starting from the 1st of July next year. That is a decision that we have warmly welcomed as the Super Members Council, indeed declaring it a supersized investment. It costs $1.1 billion over the forward estimates and around $600 million thereafter ongoing. That will help 180,000 families, Australian families, each and every year that measure is in place going forward. But the other kind of cost of living measures that were unveiled in the budget were, of course, those $300 credit off of people's energy bills. That's not means tested, around $75 a quarter. And of course, the stage 3 tax cuts will come into effect from 1st of July. We have also kept a very close eye on the government's articulation about the sorts of things that it wants to provision for pay rises for the highly feminised sectors of early childhood workers and aged care workers. And indeed, there was confirmation and a nod in the budget papers and the Treasurer's speech last night that nodded at the allocation of money ahead of the announcement, the decisions that will be formally handed down by the Fair Work Commission in coming months. But that is all squirreled away in the decisions taken but not yet announced contingency reserves of the government. And of course, we now, watch that kind of public and detailed conversation as the public absorbs the detail of the budget. Tomorrow night, there will, of course, be the traditional budget in reply speech from the opposition leader, and then the parliamentary processes around looking at the budget measures as they come forward in legislation. We just want to quickly also cover off on the reception to the budget so far. If we jump to our next slide. We're going to take you through today some of that granular detail, but here is how the budget is received, obviously from the super sector's point of view, but also more generally for Australian working parents. Those measures around the investment in super unpaid parental leave were strongly in focus in the sort of coverage of the budget in many major news outlets, but also you can see from the front pages of the papers, people highlighting that challenge around trying to navigate carefully how to tame that inflation drag and the ways in which that electricity relief has been structured to try to not add more pressure to that situation. But of course, there's also that really important challenge that every treasurer and every budget always confronts, which is how to also try to tackle the structural challenges of the budget into the next part of the history of our country. This year, of course, there was a second surplus delivered in a row before forecasts for periods of deficit ahead. So that will be something that all of us will keep a weather eye on. I am now going to hand over to Matt Linden to take you through the granular detail. Please pop questions into the Q&A function again, and we'll try to work through as many of them between us as we can. Over to you, Matt.
That's great. Thanks very much, Misha, and good afternoon, everyone. Now, budgets always present an opportunity for governments to tell their story and set the agenda. These days, as Misha said, so much is released before budget that there really are seldom surprises. Nevertheless, let's skate through some of the detail contained in the budget papers and what it means for the 11 million members who entrust their savings to our funds. So, now first, this is the figures which obviously everyone looks at are the budget bottom line, and the government, as Misha said, is estimated a larger surplus for this year of 9.3 billion. But the budget does deteriorate slightly over the forward estimates, mainly due to the effect of policy decisions which it has taken. The government is obviously walking a fine line here between supporting the economy and not triggering a response from the RBA. And really only time will tell whether or not they've got this balance right. But we do need to be mindful. We do need to be mindful that while these headline numbers are closely studied by economists, what matters more is what's happening in the real economy. That's jobs, wages, and prices. So, what does the budget have in store in respect to the real economy? The story here is that the government expects that unemployment is going to tick up by around 0.5 percentage point, but this will occur slightly later than they thought in December. Better news is the inflation forecast. It's going to decline, and wages growth is going to remain healthily above it. Combined with the increase in the SG in July this year and next, this is going to support strong contributions into member accounts, and they'll be solid. All right, so for the investment folk who are listening in, the budget forecasts a lower bond yield out into the forward estimates of 4.2%, which is around 50 basis points lower. This reflects market expectations around a moderation in inflation and interest rates. It is also a contributor to lower superannuation tax revenues on account of lower implied returns in excess of the lower risk-free rate represented by bonds. Okay, so in terms of substantive superannuation measures, the big news in the budget, of course, was in relation to the announcements around closing the gender super gap, with the focus being, as Misha mentioned, from July next year, the payment of 12% SG on Commonwealth paid parental leave. Once implemented, the price tag's around $600 million per annum. To put this into perspective, this is close to the annual cost of the low income super contribution, something though which has declined in value in real terms since its introduction. In current dollars, for future generations of women, it will close the super gap by around 1/3, which is a big step forward. So coupled with this budget, as Misha mentioned, the government has squirreled away in the contingency reserve provision to support higher wages for feminised sectors in the economy, including early childhood and further increases in aged care wages. And these could see the super contributions of these workers in these industries increase by double-digit percentages, making further material inroads. Okay, so we obviously, one of the key measures which we've been tracking very closely in the budget and is around unpaid superannuation. In the budget, we were expecting more detail than was there, but the government has included some additional funding to support the rollout of unpaid superannuation for employers, and they're also making some changes to the fair entitlement guarantee to increase superannuation recoveries. Pretty modestly, I've got to say, $44 million over the next 4 years, which compares to a problem which is around more in excess of $4 billion a year. We expect over the coming months, the government's going to be settling the detail around unpaid superannuation and introducing legislation to enact it. It is a really important reform. In terms of other key measures, the government announced in the budget that it would extend the freeze on deeming rates for another year. Now, this will obviously help retirees keep more of their earnings and pension income stream payments without losing the pension. Now, Misha mentioned earlier the significant announcements in the budget around cost of living measures. There are, of course, stage 3 tax cuts, average tax cut of almost $2,000 a year. Apart from these tax cuts, there were some important measures which represent quite targeted cost of living relief for particular cohorts in the community. So a 10% increase in rent assistance, those energy rebates, which you will have heard about, debt waivers for health debts, thanks to new indexation arrangements. Now, interestingly, the government believes that actually this spending and the way that's targeted will actually deliver a reduction in inflation, measured inflation by the ABS of around 0.5 percentage point over the coming year, which is pretty significant. Okay, another key area which we have been tracking very closely is in housing, where the government has made an announcement for more money for crisis accommodation, increased issuances under the bond aggregator, which is necessary support for those funds which are in partnerships with CHPs as institutional investors to invest in social and affordable housing. This is an area which we will continue to watch closely, especially in the opposition's budget reply, where we expect they may restate their support and possibly expand super for first homes. Okay, another area where we are anticipating perhaps more detail than was in the budget is in aged care. The government has announced some additional extra funding to continue the reform task in quality of aged care, including extra home care packages over the coming year. There's no further details on aged care funding reform. Some of those who watch this space very closely may realise that there's a task force which the government asked to look at the future funding arrangements for aged care. And there has been speculation that superannuation will, over time, factor more significantly into means-tested fees. We'll probably need to wait a few more months to see exactly what the government's response to these, the recommendations of the task force will be. So we can expect perhaps in coming years further announcements over later this year around exactly how they expect those funding arrangements to work. And that is pretty important when we're thinking about the adequacy of the system and whether or not members have adequate savings, not only to support, obviously, a good standard of living in retirement, but also when they get to their later years in retirement and they need aged care, whether it's in-home care or residential aged care, whether or not they have additional means and whether or not they'll be called upon to use them to support the quality of aged care. Now, a couple of key areas which I just wanted to touch on, which are really important. I mentioned earlier with obviously the budget position for the government means that it's pretty tight for them to consider additional measures which may have an impact on the budget. Two particular areas where we and others have been campaigning strongly are for increases in low income super tax offset and the extension of SG eligibility for under 18s. It's obviously quite disappointing that these measures weren't prioritised in this budget, but as we know, the path to reform does take time. I think, as I said, it's important to understand with the budget position, whether it's the current, the forecast deficits over the forward estimates, but also to government debt, makes it a very challenging task for government to make significant announcements. Is obviously a very significant commitment in the budget around extending super to parental leave. We will need to be cognizant as we continue to seek these important changes to improve the fairness of the system, that there are real constraints on the government in terms of its capacity to fund improvements like this, which may come with a very significant price tag. So look, with that, what I might do is hand back to you, Misha, for a Q&A. So I'll just stop sharing there and hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Always love watching Matt Linden's sizable brain in action, taking us through that granular detail. We just want to invite people to ask any questions you've got where you've got access to that level of detail as well today. I can see some who are already flying in, but please jump in now so that we can make as efficient a task as possible of whipping through requests for further detail or any additional resources. One question has come from just about the body that will allocate those grants and whether it's the one administered by the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. Yes, it is that exact one. I think it's called the Productivity, Education and Training Fund. So this is the $60 million allocation across the forwards that would put aside money for grants that would advance tripartite resources and agreements to prepare workplaces for further reforms, including an express nod in the description in the budget papers. Number 2 measures document that talked about including preparations ahead of the introduction of payday super reforms. So people can find that detail on the Department of Education and Workplace Relations website, anticipating usually once they announce sort of there is further allocation. They typically bring that forward in a kind of call for grant opportunity call, and that's the point at which employer and employee organisations can look to put forward proposals for funding. Matt, any further detail that we should add on that before we jump into?
No, not really. But look, one point which I would raise, Misha, is there was a significant part of the budget, which there normally is, in terms of targeted measures for small business. I think we all need to be cognizant that the key sector in terms of businesses which will need help with transitioning to payday super are small business. So in the budget there were a number of cash flow initiatives which the government extended. They extended the instant asset tax write-off, and they're also rolling out a system or a register for late payers for business-to-business transactions. So we've certainly heard from talking to some of those businesses which do find cash flow challenging that those sorts of things will help. So I think it is a positive measure by the government to be extending those types of measures.
Yeah, terrific. Matt, another one you can field, I think. Question is about the proposed $3 million limit to a super account before the 30% tax rate kicks in on unrealised earnings. Question is, do we know how this will be applied to index-linked pensions that have been brought at the point of retirement with a residual accumulation account?
Yeah, so there are some regulations which there's a lot of discussion around exactly how this will apply, and the same applies to defined benefit schemes. So the Economics Committee, which inquired into this bill, did look at this issue, and there are a number of people who came before that committee to sort of identify there was some further detail that really needed to be worked out in relation to the operation of this in those circumstances. So what I'd say is that I suspect that maybe the final detail on that has not necessarily been landed yet. There has, and in some of our discussions with some of the senators, who will be important for, deciding how this legislation progresses. It is very clear that there's been a pretty strong effort by those who are affected by these changes to try and wind them back. One of them is obviously the $3 million cap, which isn't indexed, and there have been calls for that to be indexed. We talked earlier about obviously the LISTO. The LISTO has income thresholds which are not indexed. So I do need to think about priorities, and I think parliamentarians need to think about priorities in terms of, in a perfect world, maybe quite beneficial to index thresholds like this, but certainly if you're to look at where the priority might lie, those thresholds for the low income super tax offset might be a good place to start.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Matt. Please keep your questions coming in. We've got 7 minutes on the clock, so let's make every minute count. Another question on following the addition of super adding to paid parental leave. Has there been any discussion around mandating super on employer paid parental pay?
Yeah, so this is something which is in the remit of Tony Burke as Employment Relations Minister. So it is an issue which has sort of come up consistently, and I expect that there will be continue to be advocacy around requiring it. So it does mean extending obviously the nature of leave entitlements which attract the superannuation guarantee. I suspect the government's approach here is to lead by example. So they're wanting to, as a first step, ensure that obviously the Commonwealth program has superannuation attached to it. And I think it'll be a separate discussion around whether or not for employers they do that. We do know that a lot of employers already do pay super on their leave entitlements, parental leave entitlements, which is really important. And I think in the superannuation industry and finance sector sort of lead the way in respect to that. And there is work obviously for some of those bodies, including WGEA, to shine a light on areas where employers do this, and they recognise the importance of that for their employees and retaining really skilled workers into the future.
Another question on a related theme. Someone's asking, can we clarify, are we correct that that superannuation to be paid on paid parental leave requires the passage of legislation through the Parliament?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, it will require the passage of legislation through the Parliament. It's obviously not commencing until July next year. It coincides with when the SG reaches 12%. But we'd expect to see legislation for that coming forward in coming months. It's obviously an important thing to get legislated as quickly as possible. I haven't heard any opposition to it as a measure, so we'd hope that that attracts bipartisan support and is passed very swiftly.
Okay. Comment from Benedict Davies. Excellent. Further fact, in 2020, 22-23, 63% of employers offered employer-funded parental leave. Of these, 86% paid superannuation on paid parental leave. Terrific proof point. Thank you so much, Benedict. And there's some further detail in the Women's Budget Statement for those of you who are interested in next level of detail. I think for our part, the Super Members Council is going to continue to keep that really strong focus on measures that can further strengthen equity in this system, including looking at that that disparity in across the genders for trying to keep closing that gap and measures that sensibly do that. One issue that was sort of raised in conversation last night in the course of the lockup was also looking at the circumstances of women, older women, who may have not had superannuation paid through the entire course of their working lives, and whether that can be a useful net of the sector and the nation's thinking around policy issues. Just finally, last 2 minutes, whether there's anything else we want to throw forward to. Just wondering, Matt, if there's anything else that occurs to you that's worth us just sort of recapping or delving into as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I did mention that obviously in budget week, there's always the opportunity for the opposition to present its view on the budget. So we'll get to hear on Thursday night their views on the detail of this budget, measures which they likely to support, others which they may disagree with the government over. As I mentioned, we will be looking very closely in respect to whether or not they reaffirm their policy from the last election around accessing superannuation for first home buyers, and whether or not in fact they think about extending or expanding that scheme. We know in the Senate a references committee has been looking at this issue and has released an interim report with a number of recommendations to suggest either higher limits or caps on that scheme, or in fact having an uncapped scheme, which we've begun to have a look at the impacts of, which has obviously involved quite significant price impacts. So it would be inflationary, would diminish balances, and would of course have a long-term budget and fiscal cost. So we'll have a look in detail, obviously, at the budget reply to see whether or not there's any changes to those policies.
We have a final question. Do we have much detail about plans to improve deployment of capital to support investment in renewable energy in Australia, i.e. creating the streamlined front door that has been referenced in some dispatches? I think it is fair to say, Matt, before I preempt your answer, that this idea is at an early stage of thinking within and across the government, and perhaps hasn't yet had that sort of next level of detailed thinking about what a front door might look like. Yes, from my vantage point. But if there's anything further we should kind of call out on that, obviously there's a really urgent imperative for Australia and the world indeed to make that net zero transition. Time is ticking. But also we will be working very closely across the government to help kind of understand the thinking of what that might look like in a more structured way in terms of the direct connection for investors to consider those opportunities, always with a strong eye to delivering the strongest possible returns for the members of super funds. Anything further you want to add on that, Matt?
No, look, we did talk to a number of business groups which look very closely at these types of initiatives. I think they are really encouraged, obviously, by the government's focus on those investments and the importance of them in the economy, given the major transitions which we know are needed into the future. They were maybe hoping for a bit more detail in terms of how that would work in practice, but we do know it's a massive task. It is very, very complex. And of course, we know that the government is interested and wants to understand better and look to ways in which it can address any impediments which might impact on the way institutional investors, including superannuation funds, can invest in this area. But it's clearly a focus which it has, and I think they've got some very significant funding behind it, but clearly more work is going to be made available in respect to how this will roll out in practice.
Terrific. We are right on time, so I'm going to hold us to the discipline of being on time and on budget. Thank you all for joining us today for this post-budget webinar. There's a lovely final comment in the chat saying thank you to the team for their work on budget night, swiftly sending through high-quality material that was very useful for communication, for understanding that granular detail. Probably doesn't get those hours of life back from the budget lockup, but it is very much appreciated. Thank you so much for that beautiful comment. Wishing you all a great day. Please, if you've got further questions on detail that occur to you in the course of the next hours, days, weeks, do reach out to the team at SMC. We're really delighted to work with you all, and we feel the powerful sense of the great privilege it is for all of us to be in service to 11 million of our fellow Australians. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.